All righty, so let's get to it. So why are we here today? And I've done this in states, at different levels all over the country, and it's always the same issue. You know, our kids aren't reading well enough. So if you look at the NAEP data, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, the NAEP goes and partitions kids into below basic, basic, and proficient, and the data has just been stubbornly the same. You know, roughly 2/3 of kids are not achieving anywhere close to proficient, and roughly 1/3 are below basic, which is woefully, it's just completely inadequate. And it doesn't really matter whether you're in 4th grade or we're looking at 8th grade data, or frankly, if we're looking at end of secondary school data. It's just stubbornly persistent. And, you know, occasionally these things move by a point or two, but that's not going to get us where we need to be. So to change reading achievement, we need some things to happen. They need to be fundamentally different than what we've been doing, under the idea that if you keep doing what you always do, you get what you always get, right? We need, so effective reading teacher requires deep knowledge and expertise. And I'm talking about everybody who's involved with literacy education, with teaching literacy, whether it's a professor at a university, and just up front, some of them have inadequate knowledge. They just do, and they are stubbornly persistent that they're right. Whether you're teaching in the classroom, whether you're an administrator, whether you work in a central office at a district, whether you're the superintendent, or whether you're on the school board, everybody needs a lot more knowledge about reading and why we're not getting where we need to do. Number 2, before we teach, we must know what to do, and it must be right. It must be correct. There's all kinds of things that we can do, but they're not all necessarily correct. We have to know what to do. And the last one is, what we do, it really has to be quite different than what we've been doing in the past. If it's just a little tweak of what we're doing, we're going to bring in this new program, which a district or a school might consider a huge tweak, but probably not so much. You know, this happens all the time throughout the years, and nothing much changes. You all go through this little pirouettes about how to ramp it up, and, so we need fundamental change on this. I want you to take a couple minutes and read this story, please. So I'm using this story as an analogy to reading, to how we take care of reading. The idea that we have to water the roots of reading, really to grow strong readers, we must first understand what the roots are, be able to identify them, completely understand what they do and how they interact with each other. And we have to be certain that we are adequately developing the roots. And this really requires knowledge, skill, and attention. The idea that if you spend all your day in faculty meetings talking about the Common Core and trying to hit those Common Core standards, and you're ignoring what leads up to reaching those standards, then nothing's going to change. We have to look at the roots. We have to change how we water the roots. So the agenda, we're going to go through this, and I apologize, I'm going through a lot of stuff here. So I have to go pretty quick, but we're going to talk about an overview quickly of reading cognition and a little bit of theory. We're going to talk about, we're going to unbundle the roots and look at some of the roots individually. We're going to look at some of the research behind developmental spelling. I'm not going to explain the DSA to you, the Deal Center will do that. But we're going to look at some of the research that goes into that. It has a rich research history. We're going to look at the developmental trajectory to orthographic understanding. How do kids get there to where they can read words with automaticity? And then I'm going to talk to you at the end about putting it all together. I'm going to show you some of the research that we've done over the years that really is fairly profound about what all this means at the end of the day for reading achievement. So how do you know you're on the right road? You know, when I came down here, I left the airport in Atlanta. God, you know, thank God my MapQuest, you know, I stuck it in there, you know, it's talking to me, and I had a great road map that was guiding where I needed to go, right? And so how do you know when you teach reading that you're on the right road? So what this gets into is really the idea of how the brain processes print into words, into sound, and some of the theory that goes through that. It is very helpful to have an understanding of some of the theory that guides reading. So I'd say that Nike is wrong to just do it. In other words, just teach reading, whatever that is, without deep knowledge of the fundamentals that go into it. That's just a fool's errand. It just is. It must be the right stuff at the right time, in the right place, to the right individual. So we have to know what that is. So really, competent reading instruction, you have to have knowledge of some theory. You can't just do any old thing because theory guides your actions. And you have to have deep knowledge and skill at practice. And the two are interactive with each other. And when you think about theory, so what exactly is a theory? Well, a theory is just simply, it's a big picture that explains the mechanism, the various components within a mechanism, and how they might interact. We have theories for all kinds of stuff in human endeavors. I suspect I could ask you some questions, and all of you have theories about things, whether you've actually thought about it or not. You say, well, yeah, you know, I do this because of this, and if I don't do this, then this is going to happen. You know, that's a theory of sorts. It may not have any empirical data behind it, but it's a theoretical idea. So I want you to turn to your elbow partner, and I want you to share your theory of how do we learn to read. And I'm not talking about instruction. Don't talk about instruction. What goes on in the brain that causes us to read? Take a minute and do that, please. Okay, so I'm sure I'm not giving you enough time to work through all this, but anyhow, so the first step that I want to talk about is understanding the cognition of reading. Cognition, the brain work that goes into this. So, and this puts into the area of the neuroscience of reading. So reading, and let's get this clear, reading is a content area, just like your colleagues in secondary grades who teach chemistry or biology or calculus. To be reading has a content area. It's scientifically established. It's been empirically shown to be correct. So it's a content area, and we have a responsibility to understand that content area well. So as a reading teacher. So this is all really about the neuroscience of reading. So there's some researchers that got this started up at Yale University, Sally Shaywitz and her husband. And they would use magnetic resonance imaging, you know, putting you in that big machine that makes all that noise. And they could take, you know, real pictures of the brain. And the pictures that they're getting are really the blood flow that goes to the brain given certain stimuli. And so they were able to identify the really specific areas of the brain, and science has known somewhat about this for a long time when people, you know, lose speech and this type of thing. But they were really able to zero in some of the specific areas of the brain involved in the various aspects of reading. Not reading in general, but for example, you get the Broca's area around articulation, getting the words out of your mouth, the parietal region around word analysis, and occipital temporal region around word forms. So, and there's other areas, but these all work in interaction. So what their research showed, well, let's back up for a minute. So when I taught reading, I was a middle school special ed teacher, and I knew that if I could do certain things with my students, okay, for example, repeated reading, I could improve their reading outcome. And so as teachers, if you're using, you know, the right type of methods, we know that we can get students to become better readers. What they did, they took a group of students, and they were adolescents, middle school students, who were really poor readers. They put them into a year's worth of treatment, the kind of stuff that we would do in school with the kids. It wasn't some kind of, you know, magical hocus pocus that was done at the university. Things like repeated reading, things like word analysis, these type of strategies, what we know will help make kids better readers. They measured them a year later, and they saw incredible differences in the brain. And remember, what this measures is blood flow to the brain. They could see that these areas were much more active than they were before. And so they brought these kids back. So they measured them before, they measured them a year later. They brought them back a year after that. They were all done with everything. They brought them all back, and it was permanent. The same type of results that they saw after the treatment was still there. So this was really kind of interesting, but it kind of confirmed in a different sort of way what we already knew, that if we can do this, this, and this, that we can increase reading results. We can make kids better readers. So another thing, if we dig deeper into this, so what's going on? Well, I call it of neurons and dendrites. You know, the very specific cells within the brain where learning is constructed. And it's not just learning about reading, it's anything that we learn as human beings. This is how it happens within the billions of cells in the brain. And you all probably have an idea about this. So if you go and you look at synapses, synapses are the connection between all these cells. Signals convert to learning where the synapses meet, and through repetition, through practice, these synapses become strong. It's kind of like concrete. They start to bond with each other. They hook up with each other. So that signal that's going through the brain that's repeated, it's reinforced, it strengthens, and it turns into permanent learning, permanent kind of memory. And it has, so this basic, simple idea has really profound implications for how we teach reading, how we go about it. So as a reading teacher, you absolutely, undoubtedly, you are involved in brain work. And it is really critical, important work. And, you know, just as we would expect to go to a doctor who's not too lackadaisical, what they're going to do to us or to do to our body, that's what we should be, our attitude with our kids. We have to know, we have to be specific, we need to be correct. So I'm going to go through a couple of theories. Who's heard of the verbal efficiency theory? Raise your hand if you're familiar with or heard about it. What about the triangle model? Has anybody heard of the triangle model? Okay, I'm getting a couple hands. What about the simple view? Have we heard of the simple view of reading? Okay. And have we heard of sociocognitive theory? Have we heard of that? Okay, a few more hands. So let's go through an overview. So the verbal efficiency theory. So this is a cognitive psychologist out of Pittsburgh, Charles Perfetti. So it's premised on, number one, working memory is limited. Okay, that should, you know, that was firmly established in 1956 by a guy named Miller. The magic number, 7 plus or minus 2. It's a really famous study. You'll see it once in a while. That establishes that we can hold, on average, about 7 pieces of information in working memory, plus or minus 2. The amount of attention devoted to a task is determined by our processing experience, how well the task has been learned. If you know something really well, you don't have to do a whole lot of don't have to pay much attention to it, is it? You know, if you know how to get to work, my car automatically goes to the office. You know, occasionally my wife says, "Where are you going?" It's like, oh. It's just automatic, right? Resource allocation, how we direct our limited attention among competing elements. You know, right now, I think most of you are listening to me, but you know what? There's other things you could be doing right now, isn't there? You could be doing this. You could be looking at me and not really listening to what I'm saying, but you're looking. You appear to be paying attention. There's all kinds of things. So we have to direct our attention among competing other things that compete for our attention. And as teachers, you all know this completely with that. The reading system is composed of many sub-processes, or Perfetti calls them local processes. You know, one thing gets good, it leads to another, leads to another. We're going to talk more about that. And a reading comprehension is completely limited by the efficiency of these processes. Doesn't that make sense? If your car isn't really running right, it's going to limit how well it works, depending on what the issue is. You got a flat tire, it's not going to run well at all. You got a bad transmission, you're going to have trouble getting up to speed. So how well all these sub-processes work are related. And then verbal efficiency is really, it's the quality of all these outcomes relative to the cost of the processing. So read this word right quick. Got it? Okay. Whoops. Oh. So this is kind of a word that you probably don't encounter every day. It's decodable, isn't it? Subdermatoglyphic, okay? But if you had to just do what I just did, subdermatoglyphic, there's a processing cost. You didn't just run right through the word. You had to stop and process that word. Yeah? Now, if you have good, adequate decoding strategies, you got through the word, you could decode it, and then finally get to where you could pronounce it. It may take a few more encounters where it just slides off your tongue. But that's the idea of processing cost. It's one example of processing cost. And if you understand that this goes on with all kinds of things around reading, now you can kind of see why kids might have some difficulty. So this magic number 7, plus or minus 2. So you can take a number. This is why we chunk numbers. We chunk phone numbers. We chunk Social Security numbers. We chunk all kinds of information. That's a strategy that you all probably learned when you had to prep up for tests when you were in college. You know, there's all kinds of things. If you had to learn a long list, one thing I would do is I'd go around my living room and I'd say, okay, the lamp's representing that, the fireplace is that, the mantle is going to be that. You know, I'd hang things, and because I had a good picture of my room, right? And I could say, bam, 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 bam. As long as I remembered that, and so, or you create an acronym, right? These are all ways to do that. So a simple task. I want you to turn to your neighbor and just relate your phone number. Just tell them your phone number. I'm going to tell you mine. Okay. Okay, so in this day and age when we don't really remember anybody's phone number, so hopefully you were able to do that. Sometimes I'll tell you, I don't know them. I don't call my phone number. I just... Okay, now, a more difficult task. I want you to share the phone number I just showed you a couple slides ago. So what's that number? Really quick, share that with your neighbor. Okay, so if that was a little more challenging, then here it is. Okay, so the point of this, the takeaway, is the amount of attention devoted to a task is determined by the processing experience, how well you've learned the task. You know, you generally will probably know your phone number really well, but you didn't know this other phone number because you haven't processed. If I asked you to memorize it, we'd go through it, and you would do whatever you do to memorize something, and and then we'd all get 100% on that little test, wouldn't we? But we haven't devoted that attention. So how much attention you devote to something is how well you've learned it. So some more about the verbal efficiency. It involves all kinds of processes. Things like schema activation, right? You all know about that. Propositional encoding. Propositions are what sentences are made of. The man entered the door, proposition. Walked through the living room, proposition. Entered the kitchen, proposition. And proceeded to make a cup of coffee. 5 propositions within a sentence. Lexical access. Is the process automatic, or is it costly, like you just experienced? And then not all processes require the same amount of mental resources. And then we can train processes where they require very little resources. That's why we want kids to be fluent readers. Then they don't have to spend costly processing on trying to say the words, when in fact we want them to understand the words and understand the point. So a highly skilled reader is going to have automatic decoding processes and some automatic comprehension processes on top of that. And so the text and the reader schema, so they can quickly interact to create higher order knowledge structures. That's what we're trying to get to. And there's a huge amount involved in that. Sounds pretty simple, doesn't it? But it's complicated, it's complex. So when the sub-processes work efficiently, the reader can focus on all of this stuff. We've covered this. I want to do this. So take this example. So efficient processing of a text, it doesn't necessarily mean efficiency with another text. As you all probably, I can have a kid read something pretty well, give them something different, and they may not read it quite so well, right? So you can take 2 students reading the same text. They might have different skill levels. If I give them enough time, they may both get through the text and finish it and, kind of, okay, well, that's fine. But the one student took 2 minutes, the other student took 5 or 6 or 7 or 8, right? But as soon as I impose a time constraint on it, then the second student is out of the game. And education is all about time constraints, as is work and everything else that you do. Time does matter. We do not have infinite amounts of time to do whatever it is, all the different things that we have to do. Time is of the essence. So I want you to turn to your neighbor and tell them 1 or 2 things about the verbal efficiency theory. Do that, please. 1 or 2 things. Okay, that was time for 1 or 2. You overachievers are going down to 5 and 6 and 7. I got to move on. Let's talk about the triangle model. So one of the authors of the triangle model is a guy named Siedenberg, who wrote the book Language at the Speed of Sight that came out last year. Really, really interesting read about reading education and the state of it in America. So what they proposed was the idea that reading is composed of these various processors, one of which is the phonological process. Now, when we talk about phonological, we're always talking about sounds. Phonics, phonographs, we're talking about sound. So the idea that language has to be processed and turned into sound, right? Isn't that what we do when we read? We're taking text, turning it into sound. And frankly, whether we're reading orally or silently, that's what we do. The orthographic processor. Orthographics, of course, refer to the actual graphemes that we have in reading, the actual letters, the letters that are combined to make words, words into sentences. So we're really talking about really at the word level, that we have to successfully convert the printed graphemes on the page to sounds that, and or into the orthographic processor. The third part is the meaning processor, right? This is where we make meaning with comprehension. Of course, comprehension is moderated or mediated by context. Context is really important. But notice what context does not mediate. It does not mediate the phonological or orthographic processors. That's what it doesn't do. But it does do this. If you're encountering the word bear, which we all know can mean to bear a load, or that big furry thing with claws, context is going to help the student or the reader decide, well, which bear are they talking about? So that's where the phonological, the context part comes into this. So a couple things about this model. If you think about this model, number one, look at the letters. The arrows, they're double-headed. So all of these processes, they're interactive. They interact with each other. When they're working well, they're extraordinarily fast and efficient. So you may recognize a word, convert it to sound, activate the meaning very quickly, literally within maybe a quarter of a second, a third of a second for a given word. It works really, really fast when it's efficient. When it's not efficient, it can actually work not at all. So we can have anything in between. And then, of course, context is really important to comprehension. And all kinds of things go into that whole context kind of thing that we're not really getting into right here. So this triangle model. So what might this mean for instruction, for developing a reader? Somebody raise your hand if you got a comment. What might all this mean? If we kind of go to the idea of developing readers. Okay, so understanding that they're interactive and focusing on one is insufficient. Okay, very good, because you're actually hurting the other. Any other ideas? That's a good comment. Okay, very good. Very good. So one of the things that I hear all the time when I go into schools, and I usually know the school I'm going into as far as what the levels of the readers are. And so I go into a lot of schools that are struggling with struggling readers, and I'll walk by a third grade classroom where I know these kids don't know how to decode very well, and they're definitely not fluent readers, and I hear the teacher banging on, use your inferencing skills. So I'm hearing them use your inferencing skills when in fact the children are having, many of them in that room, the majority plus, are having extreme difficulty just decoding the words, taking the word from print to sound. And so to say use your inferencing skills would just be really inappropriate. It's frustrating for the kids. It doesn't help them. They don't even know what that means necessarily. Not okay. So this is what I mean. This is how this all really informs what we're doing. The simple view of reading. The simple view of reading is really quite popular. A couple of linguists, Hoover and Go in 1990. So it's hypothesizing that reading is composed of the ability to decode words, plus it would be reading comprehension is the outcome of decoding words, plus the language that the child understands, plus the interaction of the two, the idea that the sum is greater, that the whole is greater than the sum of the two. So this is really interesting. And this, when you start looking at these things, they're all saying the same thing in different ways. So there's three possibilities for poor reading, according to the simple view. Number one, you could have poor decoding, but have good linguistic comprehension, but you're going to have poor reading as a result of that. You could have good decoding, but poor linguistic understanding. In other words, they just don't understand enough words. That could lead to poor reading. Or you could have both. And of course, a good reader is going to have both. They're going to have strong decoding, strong linguistic abilities. So there's three things that could lead to poor reading right here. So here's the kind of the A-frame of the simple view. And this really helps to understand when I talk about sub-processes, or Perfetti talks about local processes, this explicitly puts them together. So at the top we have reading comprehension. If we come down the red side, we have language comprehension, we have decoding ability on the right. But look what's below language comprehension. Linguistic knowledge would just be the oral vocabulary, the listening and speaking vocabulary that kids bring into the classroom. Background knowledge, which is important. You understand more if you have some foundational knowledge about an idea. Phonology, what do you understand about sounds, which has everything to do with phonemic awareness. The idea of syntax, understanding how words are ordered in sentences. And kids definitely start hitting the wall in syntax, particularly when they start getting out of the early elementary grades into upper elementary and middle school, because they encounter text with unfamiliar syntax. It becomes more academic, different syntax, and it trips them up. And then semantics, the meanings of words. We go down the decoding side of the ladder, and look at that. So we have cipher knowledge. Here I defined what cipher, kind of an old school word, but it's knowledge of the internalized code. What do they know about the code? Ciphering knowledge. And then lexical knowledge. Lexical knowledge goes also around the idea of meaning into printed words, or the meaning of printed words. Phonemic awareness, knowledge of the alphabetic principle, which is simply the awakening one day that, oh, these letters and these combinations of letters represent sounds that I use when I talk. Yeah, that's the alphabetic principle. Kids have got to come to that understanding. And then we can talk about letter knowledge. Major predictor of reading. If you're going to learn how to read, yeah, you need to know the letters of the alphabet. Instantly, automatically, upper and lower case. It's not okay to know, well, I know 46 of them. Kind of need to know them all. And then early concepts about print. So those are some of the basic building blocks of the simple view. And notice how these things go up. They lead one thing to the other. So if you have a breakdown in one of these processes, let's say that a child just doesn't have phonology. They've never been taught phonological phonemic awareness. Guess what they're going to have? They're going to have a really hard time learning how to decode words. They might still get it eventually, but it's going to be just walking through the mud. It's almost not even fair to the kid. It's, to do that. A child maybe, for example, who has, poor cipher knowledge, it's going to be a problem. So all these things have to be strong. And if one of them is broken down, you can see how it affects the entire system. It's kind of like having a shaky wall in your house. You got a two-story house, and that front wall now is for whatever, the termites are about to collapse it. May bring down a third of your house, right? So this is how these things go. So let's talk a little bit about the sociocultural theory, a really different theory. So this goes back to Vygotsky. I'm sure all of you are familiar with the zone of proximal development. That's the work of Vygotsky, a Russian psychologist in the 1920s. His book actually, long after he died, was discovered and then published in 1962. So sociocultural theory regards language as the most important of the semiotic processes. So what's that? It's the use of signs for meaning making. And we use signs all kinds of ways, don't we? We use signs, numbers, are those signs? Yeah, absolutely. When you sign to communicate, people who are deaf, yeah. So we have all kinds of Morse code, that's a sign. So we have all kinds of these things, but language. So we can look at what Dewey called the tool of all tools. So think about this. This will make sense to you, I think. So we can look at first order signs as the ability to speak and understand. We can look at the second order as the understanding of written systems. Okay? So for, thousands and thousands of years, our species pretty much just did the first part. Yeah? We didn't have writing systems. They weren't prevalent. We didn't have to do any of that. We just did the first part. The other thing about sociocultural theory is language develops not in isolation, but it's socially constructed. Socially constructed. And I really don't think you can argue any other way with this. So language, or the discourse of instruction, what you all do in the classroom every day, discourse is how we do instruction. We don't sit there and, we use language. We don't do it any other way. We have to speak. So the primary discourse, but the problem comes, is when we have children whose primary discourse, what they come with at home, I've seen the heads nodding, doesn't match up to the discourse of instruction. Doesn't match up to the discourse of instruction. So kids are going to struggle to keep up with the discourse that's outside of their primary discourse. Unfamiliar words, strange syntax, so on and so forth. So the sociocultural theory, partially at least, accounts for really the differences in vocabulary acquisition. Some of you may have heard of the Hart and Risley study, the 30 million word catastrophe, and there's other studies now showing much of the same thing. That depending on the SES of your household, of which you grew up in, the words that you know can vastly differ, can be incredible, and how much language you've been exposed to can be incredibly different. And so, the study basically shows that, Hart and Risley, that children growing up in low SES households were exposed to about 15 million words a year versus the kids who grew up in households of professors, that's what the study measured, heard about 45 million words. 15, 45. It seems like we have a gap here that I can't begin to spread my arms wide enough to get around. And that has profound implications. You all know, if you teach in a school with really struggling kids who come in and speaking in 2- and 3-word utterances versus that precocious little girl who comes from a high SES and just rattles the blah, 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 you're like, okay. Wow. Yeah, that sort of thing. So I want you to discuss briefly, at a practical or fundamental level, what is the importance of these theories? What kind of takeaway are you getting? How can they inform us on what to do when we teach reading? Take a minute or so. All righty. So let's move forward and talk about instruction a little bit. So you all took this little test, I believe, the Language and Literacy Knowledge Assessment. I heard that was really popular. So it had 81 items on it. Knowledge of language had 25 questions, decoding had 25, comprehension had 25, and then we had some questions on there about the use of assessments. So the Deal Center asked me that I share the results of this test with you. Okay. No. I guess it was, yeah. Ooh, yeah, I think. So here it is. So remember, there's 81 questions. We have 195 results on this test. So the average, what we call in statistics the mean, the average was a 42. So the average score was 42 out of 81 correct. it was a 52%. So the 25th percentile was a score of about 37, the 50th was the mean of 42, and the 75th was a 48. So there's two things that we would look at when we look at this data. Number one, out of 81, yeah, we'd like that mean quite a bit higher, quite a bit higher. You know, there's a lot that needs to be learned about this. It's a normal distribution, but the standard deviation is kind of tight, you know, with it. So while the results, it just tells us where we are. We have a lot of work. You know, I give this test at my university, and the results are similar. And it doesn't seem to matter where we go. The results are fairly similar with it. So we have a lot of learning to go and a lot of things to do. And I know this test will be given again down the road, and I'm sure the results are going to be better. So I want to make this comment about time. And as teachers in elementary classrooms, you all just implicitly and like explicitly, I think, understand this. By the end of third grade for sure, and we could make a strong case that by the end of second grade, children who are not reading adequately, they understand that because they do learn. Even though we don't say this, the number one skill that's most privileged in elementary school is the ability to be able to read. Okay? The ability to be able to read. And so kids who are not acquiring this appropriately, they come to understand this, and they really do start thinking they're stupid. They start getting brain shame. They're embarrassed of themselves. And what do? They start looking for other ways to gain self-efficacy about themselves as an individual. And those other ways really, many times, counteract what we're trying to do academically with them. And so that's why, you know, wherever we do this, where we engage in this work, and this is what I've done for a long time with Teresa, that time is just critical. We don't have a lot of time with these kids before their self-efficacy starts going to the floor, to the basement, and they kind of don't want to hear about it anymore. So that's my point with this. So let's unbundle the roots a little bit and talk about that. So this is just a little story. I found this picture of this child writing on the wall, emerging literacy skills. Who was writing on the wall? So I heard this from my father. I'm the oldest of 9 kids. And we had a back staircase with a big white wall. And invariably, every so often, we'd see big old crayon circles. I suspect I did that. I don't remember doing it exactly, but I won't say I didn't. And Dad would just get frustrated. You know, who's writing on the walls? And if Dad were alive today, I'd say, well, you know, those are our emerging literacy skills, Dad. You know. Anyhow, so the reading roots, the sub-skills or the local processes, there are many. We're going to focus in on these today. We can look at phonological awareness. We can look at letter ID. Two of the two prominent predictors of whether a child's going to gain literacy by the end of first grade. Critically important. Letter feature understanding. We can look at word reading ability, fluency, and comprehension. Okay. And although we talk about these in isolation, we study these in isolation to try to maximize how they develop and what we can do with them. They don't work in isolation. They are interactive. They work interactively. Weaknesses in one cause weaknesses in the others. And I'll show you some data here in a few minutes where we know that they develop together. They're codependent, really, with this. Do we want to take a break? Is that what okay, so we're going to take 10 minutes for a break. When I come back, I'm going to ask you for a couple of questions. Root here, phonological and phonemic awareness. You know, of all the things in reading, this is one of the most confusing things for so many people. I get, you know, I teach master's classes and PhD classes, and so many people are still confused about this. So you can think of phonological awareness. You may have seen the umbrella, the overall umbrella, and phonemic awareness is a subset of that umbrella. So to be clear, phonemic awareness is the smallest unit of sound in a language. So different languages have different phonemes. And what we know from research is that children, infants in the cradle, immediately start hearing the sounds of the language. And by the time they're about 9 months old, they have a definite preference for the phonemes of the language that they've been hearing. So if all they've heard is English, they want to hear English phonemes. You know, you start introducing phonemes from another language, and they want to hear the English phonemes that they've gotten used to it. If they're in a bilingual household, they're going to catch the phonemes of both those languages. So this phoneme awareness. So we can think about unconscious phonemic awareness in infancy. And it's just fascinating to read. How does that baby in the cradle start to understand speech? Because, you know, I mean, it's like we hear foreign speakers, you know, a language we don't understand, and it's just da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. We might hear the prosody or the expression, but how in the world do you take that stream of speech, it sounds like, you know, just rapid-fire speech, and break it into words? Because that's the challenge the infant has. They got to break it into words. You know, doing some mother ease. Oh, sweetheart, you are so cute. You are just the cutest baby. That's right. Give me that great big smile. So how do they learn about smile out of all that? So they learn about inflections. They start understanding inflections with it. What we call lexical stress markers. So this is how they start using this as a template for speech, Now, so taking it from the unconscious and to the conscious. Now, to learn to speak, to learn a language, we don't have to be able to understand individual phonemes within words. So if you ask a kindergarten student how many sounds are in the word dog, or how many sounds are in the word frog, what are they going to say? Before they've had any instruction. How many sounds in the word frog? One. Frog. It's like, you think I'm stupid? Yeah, there's one sound, yeah. Frog, obviously, there's one sound, frog. It's not until a really good teacher starts taking them down the road through, syllabication, down into onset and rhyme, and down to phoneme isolation and manipulation, do they start recognizing a phoneme. And then they have the ability eventually to say, well, there would be 4 sounds in frog. G. 4 phonemes in frog. And that's where we got to get kids to. So, but you don't need to know any of that to learn to speak. It's not necessary to learn a language. You don't have to learn that. Phonemes are part of what gives us accents, but we don't need to learn how to speak. So this idea of phonemic awareness, explicit instruction, bringing phonemes into the conscious understanding of the child. Really critical to learning to read. Now, you can learn to read without it, but it's a lot harder. It's a lot harder. It's going to take longer. It's not going to make as much sense to kids. So it's, as we said, it's one of the two big predictors of letter acquisition, reading acquisition. And again, to be certain, you must have really good explicit instruction. I'll go into schools and I'll hear a teacher, doing syllabication. Together, tomorrow, maybe. Is that phonemic awareness instruction? No, it is not. Is it helpful? It's kind of helpful. It starts the student down the road of understanding that there's this entire word tomorrow that maybe they'd say is one sound, but then we can break it down into syllables, tomorrow, and then we can actually break a word down into its onset and rhyme, as in cat, k, at. So the cat, now they're starting to hone in on the phoneme. And then they can break it down further into 3 separate phonemes. So that's where we have to get to with phonemic awareness. So let's move forward then to letter identification, or just letter ID. So it's critical to reading acquisition. And I think that's kind of a, well, duh. Of course, you need to know the letters, right? But I'm going to show you some data here in a minute that might make you wonder. It's been shown to be a causal factor in learning letter sounds, because as you learn the letters, you do start learning some sounds about letters, right? It's kind of hard to learn a letter without learning the sounds, even though W has all kinds of sounds in it. And it's important that children connect these letter names to sounds. So there's value in all this. So we want students to be able to distinguish the orthographic patterns of the letters, the graphemes, the grapheme that is a D, the grapheme that is an O, the grapheme that is a B versus a P. Those things are really important. Those are, and as they come together, they become orthographic representations in the brain. In the brain. And as I mentioned earlier about the best predictor of end-of-year first grade achievement, letter ID, phonological awareness. They're really, really critical, and I would say phonemic awareness. We got to get them down to the phoneme level. If you have a child who can take a word, hat, and if I remove the t sound, remove the t, the t sound, and replace it with a sound, well, I've just taken it from hat to ham. Kids who can do that flexibly, that's great. That's great. So here's some research that we did down in Louisville. This is almost 1,000 kids. So what we were looking at is letter identification growth across December, February, May. We didn't measure August because we didn't really expect them to really have any letters, and we didn't want to waste the time finding out, they don't know hardly any letters, because we need teachers to teach them letters. But if you look at December across February, you can kind of see how it starts to grow. But what's interesting about this data, what's most interesting, is that bottom number under the 54, the 71.8. The other side of that number is over here in May. 28% of kids still didn't know all their letters in May in kindergarten. 28%. Now, in all fairness, some of them were missing 1 or 2, but some of them were missing 10 to 20. So, really, really great. We absolutely don't want kids going into first grade not knowing their letters. And given that first, you know what, they weren't taught right in first grade. Those kindergarten teachers, I don't know what you've ever heard that. Hope not. But yeah, goes on. So this is what goes on. So what happens in first grade if that happens? What's the first grade teacher's job? It doesn't really matter what grade you're in. You have to look at reading as a system. And we have to drop this idea that, well, this was supposed to have been taught in first grade, and it wasn't. That's not my job. My job in second grade is, no, it's not. Your job is to understand the reading system, understanding what that child's going to need to enhance that system, to make it efficient, and that's what you teach them. The idea, I've heard this way too, they'll get that in third grade. No, I might just walk her out the building, or him, to be fair. So this idea that we look at reading instruction that we bifurcate it by grade levels, we got to get rid of that idea. It is unfair to kids. It's completely unfair to kids. How would you like to be the parent? And don't hold your breath. Be careful here. How would you like to be the parent? You get in the second grade and somebody tells you, well, your child's not learning to read very well because they really never got phonemic awareness. And my response would be, oh, okay, great. Well, you're working on that. No. We do that in kindergarten. Well, wait a minute here. We got a major disconnect. We don't want a school. That's an ineffective school. We don't want that mindset going on. So letter feature knowledge. Let's talk about this. So letter feature knowledge. So to be clear, I'll use all kinds of terms. So we're talking about letter feature knowledge, letter feature understanding, what students understand about the code specifically. So that's what we're talking about. So this really got started almost by happenstance by a researcher named Reed in 1971. And Reed was looking at spelling tests with kids. And he started to notice that what kids understood about the code was reflected in their spelling, how they spelled words. Okay, and we're talking about spelling tests where you haven't been taught, you haven't memorized that some word is spelled this way, then you don't have an effective test. But if the test is really a random, that what you understand about the code is reflected in how you spell. And so the idea, and this research has continued through a guy named Henderson at the University of Virginia. So there's a deep body of research around this that is in fact correct. That's correct. That spelling is systematic. That, for example, inventive spellers are discovering the rules. This is a really good thing. Spelling gives you direct insight into what the learner understands about the code, and it tells you as a teacher what they know and what they need to learn next. Letter sound spellers have recognized this really abstract principle that we're asking 6- and 7-year-olds to get, that how a word comes out in print is related to the sounds made by the letters. That's a really abstract principle, for little kids to get. But it's amazing, and it's a testament to the power of the human brain that they do get this. So inventive spellers, what they might still be missing, but what they get as they go along, is simply the convention of English. So I'll give you an example. So who can spell cat? Asked Miss Reynolds. She was my first grade teacher. And so I raised up my hand. Any surprise that I would raise my hand? And I walked up to the door, and I looked at the board, and I proudly wrote K-A-T. And she proceeded to just basically chew me out, said that was really wrong, to get back to my seat. It's like, okay, that was the last time I raised my hand in her class. That's what I learned. So I went back. So what Ms. Reynolds didn't understand was that I had correctly identified the beginning and ending phonemes of that word by using K and T, and I'd also correctly put in the right vowel sound with that. So where was I on this? Well, if we relate this to the stage theory, we're looking, I was clearly in the letters naming stage, and I had nailed letter stage, feature 1 and feature 2 for that word, What she wasn't giving me credit for is the spelling with C is simply a convention of English. Okay, we somehow could have chosen to spell cat, K-A-T, okay? But we don't, we spell it with a C. And so that's a simple correction for a young student to make, that, oh yeah, well, hey, we got this little weird thing, we just happen to spell cat with a C. So next time you get cat, just spell it with a C and you'll be fine. And you did absolutely correct. Are we gonna get really upset about that as teachers? No, we shouldn't. Because they have all the fundamental processes in place. So some acquisition of letter ID, phonemic awareness, and this letter feature knowledge. So we studied about 2,100 kindergarten kids across 64 schools in Louisville. All kinds of schools. Many of them were struggling schools. Some of them weren't. And what you can see on this graph, so the big thing, I know there's numbers and stuff on here, but look at the lines. Just look at the shapes of the lines. We have letter feature knowledge at the bottom, the cross line. We have PA, or phonological phonemic awareness, in the middle, and letter ID at the top. And notice the bottom 2 lines. The slopes, or how fast they climb, are pretty darn close. And look at how the slopes change at the break in February. They both go up at almost the same exact increasing rate. This is pretty profound. Now, letter ID is what we would call a constrained skill. Once you know all 52, can you know more? Well, no, there aren't an extra 20 that we teach. And once you know them automatically, can you know them better, like more than automatic? No. So it's a constrained skill, so that one kind of levels off and stops growing, because it should. But PA and letter feature knowledge continue to grow. And so they grow codependently. And we need to think of this. These things grow with each other. The strands, the rope picture that she had earlier, this is what we're talking about with this. So let's move on to word reading. So we have several kinds of words that we look at. We can have standard words in English, words that reflect the spelling that's phonologically consistent, regularly used in the English lexicon. Fog, understand. These are regular words. We also have irregular, non-decodable words. Words like the, yacht, said, was, to. These don't make a lot of sense when you're trying to apply the code or your understanding of letter feature knowledge to them. We also have decodable non-words. So these would be non-standard words in English. They can be very decodable using our understanding of letter feature knowledge. It's just not how we write them. So, like Snoop Dogg, D-O-G-G. Is that decodable? Well, yeah, but we write dog with GG? No, we don't normally. Fog. Can we decode fog with a PH instead of an F? Well, yes. We do that when we read Phoenix, right? Absolutely we can. The last thing we can look at, decodable nonsense words. So these are words that we would develop when we want to assess a child's ability to apply their letter feature understanding. So these are words that we don't use in English. They're made-up words, but they're quite decodable if you understand the code. So we can measure very quickly the automatic processes that a learner has with these. So these are several different kinds of words that we use. So what's a sight word? I have people who want to argue with me. They're usually my students. They want to argue what a sight word is. So we have words that we teach to emerging readers, and that's typically what they think of as sight words. The Doach list, the Fry list, and there's other lists. Words that we teach, and there's good reasons for why we do this, right? We try to get kids up to speed where they have enough of a automatic word inventory where they can start reading at least simple sentences, and guess what? They feel like they're reading. Well, in fact, they are, right? We need that self-efficacy. They might even be irregular words that are in the lexicon, because how often does the appear in a sentence? Try reading a sentence or two without the. You really got to know that word. So we just have them memorized. THE is pronounced the. Every time you see this, say the. It's a corpus of words. Lots of times, we know that we have word sets that will make up about 60% of those that we encounter in text. If you know those words automatically, you're kind of ahead of the game. And the intention is to fast start students into reading. But there's another meaning of sight word that I want you all to understand. It's any word that's instantly converted from print to speech without the use of decoding strategies, or what we might call in academia a decoding algorithm. No decoding required. I know it instantly when I see it. And it doesn't matter whether it's a regular word, an irregular word, whatever, any kind of word that you know instantly upon sight, it immediately fires in your brain. And it's almost you can't stop the process. How many of you get annoyed with the crawler at the bottom of a TV? I have to read it. I can't not leave it alone. And I hate it. Because I want to watch what I'm getting. I don't want to watch the crawler. But so I come up with these strategies. I'll wait until to read it until the crawler, the entire sentence is almost at the end. Okay, got it. And then I'll give it another 4 or 5 seconds. Okay, I got that. It just drives me crazy, right? So crawlers. So that's an idea of this instant recognition. So that's what we want to think of sight words. And we call that automaticity. That's an important word, automaticity. We have automaticity on all kinds of things. Think of facial recognition. You know your friends instantly, right? Because you're automatic with what they look like. Your brain, and there's research on this, as to what your brain is looking at when I'm analyzing your face. Now, you get to be my age, and you start going to like high school reunions. And gee, yeah, oh hey, yeah, sure, I remember you. How you been doing for the last 40 years? It's like, I don't even know who they are. I got to relearn what their face looks like, because it is completely different, and then like, wow, you haven't changed at all. You look just, So this is really important for a multitude of tasks. So you might say, so what? Automaticity, automatic with words, so what? Well, you remember the synapses, those little things that came together that strengthen? They're critical to becoming a proficient reader, because that's where automaticity happens. It happens at those connections, and it gets built. And it's directly related. It's really important to the efficient operation of the local reading processes. So a child then who has this, if we've done a really good job teaching them letter feature understanding, that shortcuts the route to sight words. There have been studies. Okay, we're going to figure out who can get these kids to sight words, to a big inventory of sight words faster. I'm going to drill and kill them on sight word cards every day, and I'm going to beat you. You go and teach your phonics mess, and we'll just see who wins. Hands down, phonics people are winning. Because what happens when I encounter a word that I haven't been drilled on? I don't know how to read it. How do you read this word? David, you're in the 12th grade. Quit asking me that. But that's what happens. So we know that students are going to differ in the amount of sight words, the words that they know by sight, their sight word inventory that's in their head. We also know that it contributes to fluent reading processes. So think of these connections right here. Think of letter feature knowledge, how that, along with phonological processing, can convert to orthographic knowledge, how that then fires the word in the brain that becomes the automatic sight word inventory. So we got this sight word inventory that's getting bigger and bigger, and because I have letter feature understanding, I can do what we call bootstrap myself. I can figure out unknown words on my own. We want to teach our kids to fish, not keep giving them fish. It leads then to reading fluency. And reading fluency, we're going to explore that in a minute, is really important to comprehension. And you're going to learn that reading fluency mediates how many vocabulary words a kid can learn. Just think about that. How fluent a reader a kid is has an effect on how much they learn from vocabulary. So let's segue now to fluency and comprehension. And I'm putting these together because I really want you to think of fluency and comprehension. They're certainly codependent. Comprehension is really, there's so much involved in comprehension. You know, comprehension strategies are a sliver of what gets you to good comprehension. There's a lot that goes into it. So I want us to kind of put these together for a minute. So you can think of three indicators of fluent, or what I call smooth reading. You can think of reading pace, how quickly a student can process, can read, the rate of reading. We don't want kids to be speed readers because that's actually bad for comprehension, but we want them to be kind of automatic. I use the idea of conversational, something like that, unless you got a really slow talker. They probably need to read a little faster. Word identification accuracy would be a second indicator of fluency. Are they able to decode the words accurately? And the third one would be prosody, or reading with expression. We kind of ignore prosody some. I think we catch it in kindergarten with shared book readings and things, but when the kids get a little bit older, we just forget about prosody. And prosody is really, really important to comprehension. So we can look at reading rate plus word identification accuracy. I call these two bundled together acumaticity. It is not fluency because it's ignoring prosody. I don't think you can't talk about fluent reading if you're not also including prosody in there. So what do we call reading rate? Well, you know, we call it correct words per minute or words correct per minute, which I just got kind of disgusted with that. I think it's a really stilted, just a metric that's really mechanized. So let's call it something else. So I just call it acumaticity, you know, words correct per minute with that. So reading rate. So we need to, you know, focus on attainment of an appropriate reading rate, but then what does that suggest? If you have a student, you give them a text, and they can read it at an appropriate rate. What is that saying about their reading? What do you know about their reading for that text? Somebody tell me.
It's just right.
I'm sorry?
It's just right.
It's just right? Okay.
It's at a comfortable level where they can learn comprehension.
Okay.
Where they can understand meaning.
Okay, so that's good. What else do you know? Okay, so yes, so now you're understanding that if they can read it, regardless if it's grade level or otherwise. I may have had a sixth grader, like I had many of them, who maybe could read a third grade text. Well, what I knew was if they could read that third grade text, all the underlying processes that led to that third grade text were in play. I mean, they were working well enough, at least with that text. If I give them a sixth grade text, they didn't work as well. So I want you to think about relate everything to the underlying processes that have to be working right to result in appropriate reading with this. So we do know that kids need enough rate to maintain comprehension. Remember we were talking about working memory a little while ago? We need enough rate to keep that working memory afloat so we can keep things in the brain to process and think about what we're reading. So really, language decoding or slow decoding, it really causes the uptake of words, of propositions in the sentences to just dissipate. So a kid gets to the end of the sentence and they don't remember what they were reading at the beginning of the sentence. So the idea then that we can, well, they got a vocabulary issue. Well, they don't use their comprehension strategies. They're not using No, it's much more fundamental than that. We have to get the sub-processes work where they can at least to get to some kind of adequate fluency. Now, does fluency guarantee comprehension? No, absolutely it doesn't. But it's really hard to be to have good comprehension if you're not a fluent reader. That's the issue there. So when we talk about inference making, this is kind of the comprehension side of the fluency to comprehension. So again, we need to possess some knowledge of the words. We need some kind of knowledge of the concepts in the text to start making inferences with it. We need to be able to focus on the relevant information in the text. We need to be able to hold information from earlier parts of the text in our working memory in order to connect it with related information that comes later in the reading and connect it with information that we already have in our head. Our background knowledge, for example, or our world or global knowledge. And we have to be able to monitor reading for inconsistencies. So this is a lot. So if they're having issues with fluency, all of this stuff breaks down. It all just breaks down and it doesn't happen. I was always amazed with my kids who had reading disabilities of one kind or the other, that I could give them a text, and they almost always could tell me something about the text. I can only remember a couple of kids. In fact, I had one girl, she was an incredibly fluent reader. If she got up here and read, you'd kind of like go, whoa, okay. Nothing wrong with her reading, except that she could not even tell me what the text was about. Is this text about eating a hamburger or is it about Russia? I don't know. She wasn't paying any attention. But she was really an outlier and an exception that we just kind of move off the table. That's a whole other issue. So if kids have language reading rates, these comprehension processes aren't really going to happen. So this idea of acumaticity, it's incredibly related to the ability to hold information in the text that they're reading and to integrate it with text in their prior background knowledge. So that's why acumaticity is really, really important. So the role of prosody. So think about speaking when we have conversations. If I got up here and spoke in a monotone voice, you all be out that door in about 2 minutes. It's like, you're just not going to engage in a conversation with somebody who doesn't exercise prosody. So why is that? What is the deal about prosody? Well, who can tell me? Tell me, why is prosody? Think about a conversation. Why is it important?
It helps convey meaning.
Exactly. It provides a cognitive framework for the conversation. The inflection, the pauses, the emphasis. It provides comprehension. There are all kinds of comprehension cues in prosody. So it provides a template for conversation. And guess what? It does the same thing in reading. So when we read, almost all of us have that little voice in our head that's recoding. We call that the phonological loop. And it aids comprehension. And a good example of that, and we don't really send letters anymore. My mother would write me letters, and I'd get a letter from Mom. And when I read that letter, I actually heard Mom's voice. It wasn't me reading the letter. I mean, it was Mom speaking the letter to me. And I would interpret it in the way she spoke, her cadence, how she would say things. And so this is prosody. This is the cognitive architecture that's really important. We know that prosody contributes to comprehension at the elementary level, the middle school level, and the secondary level. And it becomes a comprehension tool that when you need it, nothing else will do. You got to have basic prosody, and so, but then we would have prosody. So think of it at this kind of level. If I had two actors up here and I gave them both the same line, and I had one say it this way, the other one could say that, I bet, in a very different way that would give you a totally different meaning of the same phrase or sentence. That's the role of prosody. And we all have been through classes, a literature class or something, where we weren't really sure how to interpret that line or that phrase. and we might try out what we would call prosodic contours. So that's the role of prosody with it. We know it's important in reading develop. We know, this is a study that we did a few years ago in the highest attaining school district in the state of Kentucky, that by the end of second grade, these kids all had great prosody. They had really, really good prosody. I was a little surprised. I wasn't expecting it to develop quite that young, but these were all kids who could read well, and they had really, really good prosody. So that's the potential. Now, in our struggling schools, we're not going to get to that because we have, before you can get to that, you got to get to what I call the smooth reading part of it. You have to be able to actually decode the words, string them together in some kind of decent acumaticity, and then the prosody really can start developing from there. They may have some prosody, but it really takes hold once they have the other processes in place. So the tandem theory. So how does fluency and comprehension work together? So we published this idea around here about a model about how do they work together. So work through this. So let's assume that the reader possesses acumaticity. They have no trouble. They're a smooth reader. Let's assume that they're reading for comprehension and that they monitor their comprehension. So what might happen? Well, when comprehension becomes difficult or muddy or hard, what might the reader do? What might you do? Well, I might actually slow down. I might actually reread. One of my boys, we were having a discussion about this, and he's really smart, really good reader. He goes, that's what you're supposed to? I said, yeah. He goes, oh my. He goes, I would reread. I thought that was just kind of like, not a good reader because I had to reread. I said, no, it's the other way around. So when comprehension, though, becomes evident, you've gotten through the muddy part, what might you do with your reading rate? You might increase it. Okay, I'm through that bump. I'm over that speed bump, that reading, comprehend. Now I'm going to get it back up to where, I'm going. So we want to think. So if you're a good reader with good acumaticity, good word identification, solving skills, good decoding strategies, things are clicking, it's like an accelerator. I can read a little faster, I can pull back on it. And that's how these things should work. That's what we want kids to be able to do. Always remember, fluency is text specific. A kid might be fluent with one text, but not necessarily fluent with another, and it has a lot to do with the complexity of the text. So this relationship between fluency and comprehension, we know that fluency in good readers accounts for 25% of the differences between readers. In kids who struggle, who really are challenged with reading, it's 50%, sometimes more. So we got to get kids to become fluent readers. That's really, and that's a mouthful. It's years worth of work depending on their background. But if we can't get them there, then we're never going to have them quite become. They don't have a really good shot at becoming proficient readers. The other thing about fluency is not a first grade issue. It's not a second grade issue. It's not a fifth grade issue. It's not an eighth grade issue. It's not a 12th grade issue. It's an issue across all grade levels. What happens to text as kids move through school? Well, they become more complicated. Those textbooks you read in college, were they anything like the textbooks you read in fifth grade? No. No. So you might be a fluent reader in fifth grade, and I give you a text here. You're going to be reading this in about 7 or 8 years. I got to read that? You all have heard that before. No, so that's why it's text specific, and it develops as we go through school with that. So word knowledge. So word knowledge is critical to comprehension. Well, we all know that it is. It's difficult to benefit or to get much out of a text if you're struggling with 5 to 10% of the words. And sometimes even a keyword can be really difficult. So this acquisition, this word knowledge acquisition, it's a gradual process that accumulates over time. New words are overwhelmingly learned from reading. That's how we grow our vocabularies. We grow it from reading. If you don't read much, your vocabulary is going to really stall. And it's going to be a big issue when it comes time for you to take college entrance exams and everything else. You're just not going to have it. So this really gives urgency to reading, to help students develop their reading skills as quickly as we can. So they'll find some utility. I don't necessarily ascribe to the joy of reading that every kid's going to be overwhelmed with this bubbling thing about, I can read, it's wonderful. I don't think so. I think a whole lot of kids are very utilitarian in it. It's something I have to do. I got to do it for school. I got to be able to do it for, it's something I have to do. So let's make sure they have the skill so when they need it, they got it. That's, and then some kids love to read. But I don't think it's a whole lot of kids. It's not everybody. So smartly playing read-alouds, activities, immersing schools, kids in knowledge can also be helpful with this. So I want to make sure we understand the difference between world knowledge and background knowledge. We kind of ignore this. So background knowledge, background or domain knowledge might be something that we know something specifically. So for example, a lot of books that we use, a lot of things that we use in early elementary, traditionally have involved farms. I don't know why we do that. Do we still do that? I mean, in the cities, none of those kids understand what a farm is, but that's what we do. So if you have schema for a farm, you understand animals and milk comes from cows and, all this sort of thing, then you have background knowledge and all that's going to resonate. But if you don't have background knowledge for that, then it's going to be more complicated. Someone has to teach you about what all this, well, that thing's called a cow, and things like that. That's a silo or a barn. World knowledge is a little bit different. World knowledge is developed from a lot of reading, a lot of deep reading, reading around content areas about a lot of different things. It develops over a longer period of time. Kids who read National Geographic cover to cover, you do that for 4 or 5 years, you're going to have a lot more world and global knowledge. Kids who read a variety of things are going to have a lot more global knowledge. Kids who get really interested in, little boys and dinosaurs, that's a development of global knowledge. They're not just learning about dinosaurs, they're learning about other kinds of things. So it's essential, but we have to get kids to be able to read. We have to engage them in doing this. So let's talk a little bit about letter feature understanding. It's part 3. So as I mentioned earlier, letter feature understanding, we can use that as a tool to gain insight into what a student knows about the relationships between sounds and letters within words. So this is a schema, a matrix, a guy named Gentry. This appeared in the Reading Teacher in 2000. It's really interesting how a child thinks about spelling. So the semi-phonetic stage, he starts off with that. And the child recognizes that letters might correspond to sounds. They usually can't segment the sounds in the words. They're going to use very abbreviated spelling. They'll contain all kinds of extra letters. It's pre-phonetic spelling. We get to phonetic spelling, and this is much more like when we're in our letter naming stage. Child uses a sound-based strategy as the dominant strategy. They think of a way to invent a spelling to match the sounds to the letters. This is a really good thing. Full phonemic awareness is evident as they can segment the various sounds in the words. So they go through this in the letter naming stage, even into the within word stage. Then we get to what he calls transitional. So there's really no more invented spelling. This is a demarcation. They've learned that spelling strategies are now visual, orthographic. It's like, does the word look right? And they become morphological, adding ing, adding ed, these types of things, adding pre to a word. There's a visual memory of letters and the positions that they're in. The spelling patterns from other words inform other spellings in other words. So this is being applied across a wide range of words that they encounter. And then the fourth big stage here or the fifth rather, I skipped the pre-communicative, would be the conventional stage, where we just have continual learning. Each year they transition. The child adds more and more words to their store of words that they can spell correctly, and it just deepens their spelling knowledge and their just general knowledge about words. So this is the big overall schema that we can think of about how all this develops. Your letter naming schema, your stages, your 4 stages, go into that. It just takes it a little bit more minute, gets down more to the grassroots levels. So linguistic awareness, we can have conscious awareness and reflection, really, about a spoken or written word. And really how its parts relate to other parts and the relationships within other words. So where we want to get children to is this idea. I call it bootstrapping. You might call it self-learning. The idea And that once a child gets to a certain area, a certain stage, has a certain amount of understanding about letter feature knowledge, they almost can self-teach themselves. They can apply that knowledge to new words, to more words. They can see analogies between words they know, letter feature patterns within those words. They'll find them in new words. It becomes a self-learning or a bootstrapping mechanism. That's really where we got to have every child get to. That's what we want. That's how, how do you say this word? Well, that's how you stop that. They finally get to the point where they can figure it out. It always helps to pronounce the word. You get into content classes, and I think, chemistry. Who loved all that chemistry stuff? Did you all take chemistry? I really didn't like chemistry. But all those big bad words, I would spend hours decoding them, but they were pretty much decodable. Okay, got that word. But if you didn't have those skills, it was terrible. I mean, it was just murder. So 3 kinds of linguistic awareness. We can talk about phonological awareness, awareness of phonemes, phonological memory for phonemes, decoding, isolating phonemes, and the idea, this phonotactic awareness, the idea that that there is a frequency of permissible sound sequences across words. So, for example, your letter, consonant, letter, make, made. We have a lot of that in English, don't we? But we have other letter features that don't appear very often. They're kind of rare. We don't see them. And so learners start understanding that some are very frequent and others are kind of rare. Orthographic, the idea, again, of mapping sounds to letters and words. And so really, when you encounter it, immediately the word just pops up in your brain. The spelling and everything and the associated meaning. It all comes together. It fires very quickly. And then morphologic, how a prefix, how a suffix can change the meaning of the word, how it can change the inflection, plurals and tense, how we can derive various things from different parts of speech, love to lovely, for example. And it contributes to decoding, to comprehension, and to writing. And so morphologic, that would be much in Gansky's stage 4, around derivational constancy, for example. But what I want you to understand, that all this is a developmental sequence, and it really can vary across grades. So we can't really use a strict interpretation that because a child is in 2nd grade, then absolutely they're going to be here, and if they're not here, then, well, by God, that's what I'm teaching. Yeah, we got to let go of that. It can depend a lot on the child's background, on all kinds of things. But they have to go through these sequences. They have to go through the development. You skip developmental parts, and the rest of it's just going to start breaking down. It's just going to break down. So as teachers, we really need to have a full understanding of the system, regardless of what grade we teach in, what kind of school we teach in. Do we have struggling kids or high-attaining kids? That Oldham County study I was telling you about where the kids have prosody at the end of 2nd grade. What I didn't tell you, and what I told the superintendent later in a meeting, was that you have 28% of your kids out of our sample who are struggling readers. Their jaws hit their conference table. This is how they were talking. We thought it was probably more like about 10%. Now it's about 3 times bigger than that. Because they never assessed their kids with the right kind of tools. They didn't know. So, letter feature and orthographic knowledge, the idea of incorrect spellings, are insubordinate. As a teacher, they're insubordinate to what the child's thinking process is. So as the teacher, you want to understand the thinking that went into why they spelled the word that way. Because that will unlock what they don't understand and what you now need to teach. It's as simple as that, and it's as hard as that. So all children will connect sounds to letters, their combinations. As they do it, the physical shape of those letters become solidified. They become more predictable within the child. So here's another kind of a thing. I put the 4 stages in here, and with the point of this being is that this knowledge builds across the stages. Now notice where morphological is not. It is not on the left-hand side of the screen. When the kids are in the letter naming stage, we're not talking about morphological knowledge. You know, we're more interested in the philological knowledge with all of this. So the DSA, the inventory, I want you to think of that again as a developmental continuum. It's a developmental continuum, represents increasingly complex understandings that evolves within the child, and it's really through the interaction of skillful instruction and experience with text. Experience, so skillful instruction, that's you guys. And all your knowledge that goes into determining what instruction is appropriate, what they need next, and then the child's experience with text. So remember, you know, we always got to have, you know, I always say you got to have words coming out of their mouth. They got to take those words off of the page, process them, and come out of their mouth. They got to be. That's how they're going to get better, along with the input of really good instruction. So, here's what I want you to do. I want you to take a couple minutes and process this with each other. So, the idea being, discuss what you know about the importance then of spelling development in light of all of this. So, I want us to kind of weave into this idea again of text complexity. So, text complexity, the standards talk about complexity. They talk about how to determine, how to differentiate one kind of a text from another around complexity. One of the metrics that they use, or one of the ways that they use that, would be a quantitative measurement that we can put a text into a computer and come up with some kind of a idea of its complexity. Of course, the other ways that we use, we would have a human rater actually look for various levels of meaning and a lot of other things that the computer can't do. But the computer can give us a really good idea of, it'll differentiate between texts pretty well. So the 4 stages of letter knowledge we're talking about, they're nuanced, they're developmental, they build one after the other. Children will, they don't develop in silos. In other words, a child in the letter naming stage is learning some things about the within word stage. They might actually be learning something in the within word stage, so they don't develop in silos. But we focus within the stage to get them, mastery of the stage, and then instruction would go on to the next stage, that kind of thing. But they don't develop in silos, and we shouldn't think of it that way. But on the other hand, I'd say that the stages are somewhat prerequisites. It would be really not a good idea to go and start teaching a child in the within word stage who really doesn't understand the letter naming stage. We don't want to do that. They need that again, it's not fair to the child to do that. So they need that prerequisite because we have to build. We can think of this as bricks. So the skillful instruction, the idea that implementing this, that we implement the right kind of instruction, we want to facilitate that letter knowledge development across the continuum, which means we really need to have teachers who are really deeply knowledgeable of how this works, how it builds, knowledgeable around language, and how some of these things all come together. So we really, the teachers, we have to really bring all of this knowledge together. And it's a lot, but it will just make a huge amount of difference in the outcomes that we can get with kids. It's how we're going to move from this 2/3 of kids not proficient to get where we can get a whole lot more proficient. This instruction. So, to be certain, the most valuable resource in all of this is the teacher. And we have to have teachers who are highly and deeply skilled with this. So experience with text. So for example, you could take a child and do a really great job with your letter feature knowledge. They're progressing, you got data to show that they're doing all this, but the child doesn't really spend much time processing text. And so what's going to happen with that? What are they going to be missing on the other side of the equation? Somebody tell me. Yes, all of that, and they're going to have some issues with fluency. because there's some knowledge, for example, you may know, just having a child with a large inventory of words they know by sight does not necessarily translate immediately into fluent reading. We could do a kind of a unethical experiment and just train kids to read sight words, never have them read connected text, and because there's additional knowledge in doing that. So what is some of that knowledge? Well, a big part is syntax. How words follow each other, how we combine them to make sentences, to make phrases. And that just is, it's more brain training, and the child gets that through practice experience with text. So we have to have all this dosing with all of this. They have to have this, they have to have this, and comprehension definitely comes into it. So it really requires daily reading, daily practice with text. And the other thing is we have to monitor the growth of these processes correctly. We have to know. That's a main problem that we have in education. We don't want to monitor the processes. We don't know that they're really occurring. For example, a kindergarten class where we're doing syllabication and all the kids are clapping and it looks kind of fun and happy. We do a few other things and then we say that they have phonemic awareness. And then I come behind them and test them and find out they don't, because we weren't doing the right kinds of things, the right kinds of assessments. We have to know. We have to know for each child. For each child. It's not okay to just take a general survey of the classroom and, oh yeah, I think they got it. That's what we've been doing for years, and it gets us to where we are, and we can't make any progress. Watching my time here. Okay, so this is giving you kind of a general guide. I put this together for this presentation here. So if you look at the top, you got text complexity, and you got acumaticity at the bottom. Remember, we're not trying to make them speed readers. So you can kind of see that as the letter naming, as the stages go across in the green at the top, and then we reach these big transition points where readers are kind of transitioning from one stage to the other. They're going to, their acumaticity is going to gradually increase, assuming we're doing our fluency work properly. And as they work across these stages, the complexity level of the text that they can read will gradually increase. Now, this happens fairly quickly across first, second, into third grade. It happens more slowly once kids get into later elementary and middle school. But it still continues all the way to the end of 12th grade, where the Common Core, we're talking about career and college level reading. So I'm going to leave that with this. So that's kind of brings it all together. So notice, it's not grade specific, it's developmentally specific. All these interact with each other developmentally. Okay. All right, I'm going to talk about the last part here. Let's go into part 5 about some of the putting it all together. So what you're going to see is some data, study done in many of the lowest attaining schools in JCPS, some of the lowest ones in the state. We had concentration, generational poverty, 80, 85%, free and reduced price lunch. White students and African Americans. Some of the schools were largely African American. Some of them were a big mix of low socioeconomic status. So how would you think spelling development progressed across these schools? Slowly. Yes. Slowly would be a good answer and an understatement. So here's what we found. So we measured about 4,500 kids across first, second, and third grade. This was about 29 schools in Louisville. The first grade, and this is the developmental spelling assessment, the 20-word test. So first graders at the end of the year were 1.3. That's letter feature A, beginning and ending consonants. End of school second graders were better. They were at a 2.1. They're in vowels, right? And at the end of the third grade, they were at 2.3. There was no statistical difference between end of year second and end of year third graders. They were the same. So basically, third graders spent a year in school and knew nothing more about spelling understanding than what they learned in second grade, which was completely and wholly inadequate, which was what they learned in first grade, which was completely and wholly inadequate. So this is where we started from. You know, thousands of kids in a major school district in America. We were a little surprised at this. And when I've showed this data to other reading experts, I get kind of a raised eyebrow. Oh, no, it couldn't be that bad. This is what we found. This is our data. So we started the project. Actually, it went on. The project had been going on for 2 years. So the red bars are the second year, after the second year. So we were training teachers the first year. The second year. So look at the progress that we have at the end of the second year. So first graders now, we're well into letter naming and starting to, you know, getting near the end. Second graders were out of letter naming and getting in the within word stage. And third graders were clearly in the within word stage. So we had big, huge progress. And again, this is another 4,500 kids. But we've been at this for 2 years. 2 years. But we had really different outcomes. The outcomes of this were really profound. So I do this. I call this the wallflower analogy. These are end-of-year third grade students. So there's about 1,500 of them in this, what I'm going to show you. And we're comparing sight word knowledge to acumaticity. Sight word knowledge to acumaticity. If we subscribe to the idea that to have good acumaticity, you have to know sight words. This is about, there it is, 1,500 kids. So if you look at this chart here, look at the red circle. Those are all kids who knew some sight words from 0 to 75 or so, but had no acumaticity. If you sat down and asked them to read the text, they could hardly do it. That was the end of the first year. The end of the second year, and what's really important, this is a little statistical number, think of a Venn diagram, right? 2 circles that overlap. So the relationship between sight word reading and acumaticity was about 30%. So they'd overlap about a third. A year later, it looked like this. It overlapped by 70%. Over 70% it overlapped. So we took the wallflowers who knew sight words and converted that now into being able to read connected text. Just a huge, huge difference. So what happened? What went into that? I'm showing you some pretty statistical pictures is what I call them. But what happened? What did teachers, the people who just worked so hard, what did they have to do? Well, students learned a lot more about letter-sound relationships. You saw that evidence. They could read more words automatically. They could successfully read text. They improved their acumaticity. So the whole reading system, got improved. Got improved. All the sub-processes that go into that. So think about the sub-processes that have to go into being able to do this and what happened. That was the work. So let's take this a little bit further. Relationships between foundational skills and what's the currency of education now? What do you call that here in Georgia? In Kentucky, we call it the K-Prep test. What do you call it here? Okay, so that's the currency of education. As teachers, as administrators, as superintendents, that's your report card, and really, it's all that matters. I don't like that idea. I buck it every chance I get, but it's life. So I wanted to know, really, did this idea of foundational skills have anything to do with how kids scored on their end-of-year achievement test? And so let's talk about what foundational skills are. So again, this is our end-of-year third graders. This is about almost 1,100 kids, about half African Americans and a whole lot of white kids and Hispanics and everybody else, and children with disabilities. And so we got everybody in this data set. We gave them 5 assessments. We used the DSA, the letter feature inventory. We used the test of word reading efficiency, which measures sight words, and pseudo words being the application of what a student understands about letter feature now. Can they apply it to actually decode words that they don't know? Acumaticity, how well they could read a third grade text, and this was at the 750 lexile complexity, which we know is the expectation for the Kentucky end-of-year third grade reading test. If you can read a 500 lexile text with acumaticity, but that's all you can do, you're in trouble. If you can read a 750 lexile that's good. You're in the band for expectations. And then we took the reading subtest. We didn't do all components. I took the reading subtest for the Kentucky State Reading Achievement. This is what our model looks like. So think about this, and this is what we had data on with all these kids, with these third grade kids. I don't have phonological awareness because we didn't test phonological awareness in third grade. But if you go from this, from left to right, you can see spelling knowledge. That's their score on the DSA screener. Their sight word reading score, their pseudo word reading score, their reading fluency, which was that text at 750 lexile, and then their score on the K-Prep test, their scaled score. Now watch the arrows, follow the arrows. This is what we would call the theoretical model or hypothetical model that I put together. The idea was that, gee, if a kid is good at spelling knowledge, that should lead to sight word reading, and it should enable them to read pseudo words a little bit better. Those two things in combination then lead to better reading fluency. And if a kid can read reading fluency at an acceptable level, 750 lexile, then they should do a little bit better on the K-Prep test than kids who can't. That's the model. Does that make sense? That's what we tested. So here's what we found. The model held up exactly as I put it together, except we had a major surprise. Was not expecting this. Not only was spelling knowledge important to sight word reading and pseudo word reading, it added additional explanatory variance or additional explanation power to reading fluency. Was not expecting that. I was only thinking that it would have an effect through sight word reading and through pseudo wording. It also had a direct effect, and it had a direct effect on the K-Prep test. This was just a huge, so the idea, the importance of spelling knowledge was just huge. Really, really important. And these are end of year third graders. So we wanted to then predict state reading achievements from these classroom reading results. And we gathered all this data in the classrooms. So what I wanted to know, do adequate foundational skills matter on state assessments? Foundational skills. Let's know exactly what we're talking about. We're talking about developmental spelling understanding, the DSA, and we're talking about their acumaticity. That's how I define, that's how the Common Core talks about foundational skills, and that's how we looked at it. So does it provide an advantage to kids on the K-Prep test? So we looked at those, we equally weighted spelling knowledge and acumaticity. The bar that we used, I wanted kids to, the metric that we used, if they had a 9 on the DSA screener, I said they were proficient. If they had a 95 words correct per minute on the reading test, I said they were proficient. They had to have both to be foundational knowledge proficient. One or the other was not good enough. They had to have both. So we transformed these through some statistical gymnastics and made it into a common metric. I won't go into how we do all that. And then we set a cut score that reflected those scores. We next identified the kids who were proficient on our reading quotient. That was their metric that we used. Were they proficient? Yes or no? They either were or they weren't. There was no gray. Were they proficient on the K-Prep reading subtest? Yes or no? So we coded all of them, and then we ran our statistics and held our breath. And the computer gets it back in about 3 seconds. Here's what we found. Kids who were proficient in foundational skills had a 70% chance of being proficient on the K-Prep test. Now that sounds really good. Well, how come it's not 100%? Well, because guess what? Let's see. If I want to know the difference between a fairy tale and a folk tale, what do I need to make that happen? I need one of you to teach it to me. I need a teacher to tell me the difference, right? I can read a fairy tale just fine. I can read a folk tale just fine. But I'm going to have some teacher tell me what the difference is. So that question shows up on the test, I know the answer. So that's why it's not 100%. But look at what happened in the bottom. The kids who were not proficient in foundational skills had a 20% or a 1 in 5 chance of being proficient. Okay, so let's see. I don't know. I'm running a district. Which would I prefer, 70% or 20%? I think some people still question this. So that's what we found. That's the power of foundational skills. That's the power of getting all this right. So the last thing I'm going to show you about is vocabulary learning. We talked about vocabulary learning. So this is another study that we did recently. I wanted to know, we know that vocabulary learning and comprehension are related, right? That's kind of a no-brainer. We know that. But I wanted to know, does reading rate facilitate that? There's some stuff out in the literature base that suggests that it might. A guy named Stanovich and a couple others. That, you know, fluency, reading rate, accumaticity might actually mediate how well a kid learns vocabulary. So we went and looked at all this, and that's exactly what we found. That's exactly what we found. We also found that kids in the sample, this was a middle school sample, this was a 6th and 7th grade sample. I tested them on academic vocabulary. On an assessment, we had a standardized reading assessment. We measured their accumaticity. And basically, that's what we found, that kids who could read at a good 127 words, we did a bunch of analysis and determined that 127 words a minute was kind of the cutoff. Those who were above it, they were fine. Those who were below it, which we mean you'd have a whole lot of kids that are much below it, you know, reading rate was a hindrance. It prevented, they learned a lot less vocabulary. They knew a lot less than the kids. And the idea is that, so follow this logic. If a kid doesn't know how to read very well, they struggle with decoding, they struggle with fluency, it doesn't result in a whole lot of learning because their comprehension is degraded. Are they highly motivated to read anything? No. So how do we learn words? By reading over a period of years of reading stuff. So they just don't engage in reading. So would it make sense that they don't know a whole lot of words? Absolutely. Absolutely. Okay. I am done. That's what I have today. Very good. Thank you.